And welcome back here to Live Now from Fox. I'm Andrew Kraft. We're in a new hour, 8 o'clock here on the West Coast, 11 o'clock there in Washington and in Butler, Pennsylvania, as the probes and investigations into the Trump assassination attempt continue. Our friend Fox's Connor Hansen has more from New York. Let's watch.
More than 2 weeks after 20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks tried to assassinate former President Donald Trump, new details are emerging about what led up to the shooting. Text messages obtained from local police snipers by Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley show one of the officers noticed Crooks at a nearby picnic table just before 4:30 in the afternoon. An hour later, another officer sends a picture of Crooks in a group text saying he was using a rangefinder pointed at the stage where Trump was set to speak.
He was looking up and down the building and just wandering around. It just seemed out of place.
Local officers mentioned letting Secret Service know and calling it in to their command.
Was to get a face-to-face briefing with the Secret Service snipers whenever they arrived, and that never happened.
Just after 6 p.m., the gunman was able to fire several shots minutes into Trump's speech. The FBI is still digging into the gunman's past, trying to figure out a motive.
Our investigation has revealed he also made searches related to power plants, mass shooting events, information on improvised explosive devices, and the attempted assassination of the Slovakian Prime Minister earlier this year.
As a standard part of its investigation, the FBI confirmed it will interview the former president since he was a victim of the crime. The FBI also revealed the gunman visited the site of the rally just a few days after the location was announced and flew a drone by it just a couple of hours before Trump took the stage. In New York, Connor Hansen, Fox News.
Connor, thanks so much. In the meantime here, let's bring into the conversation our friend, national security analyst and expert, Hal Kempfer. He joins me. Hal, thanks for being with us here on this pretty busy Monday. There are so many details and developments to get to into some of these probes here. Of course, we're keenly anticipating this hearing tomorrow, Hal, in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Live Now look there on Capitol Hill. So we know, Hal, that Ronald Rowe Jr., he's now the acting director of the Secret Service, and Paul Abadi, he's the deputy director of the FBI. They'll appear before the committee. It's going to be open. We're going to be airing it so viewers can hear the exchanges, can hear the testimony. While we have that shot up, though, of Capitol Hill, Hal, we are also learning who will sit on the bipartisan task force to also look into it. 7 members of the GOP on the House side and 6 Democrats. We have them as well, Hal. I'm going to read their names. Mike Kelly from Pennsylvania. I'm reading Republicans. Mark Green from Tennessee. David Joyce from Ohio. Laurel Lee from Florida. Mike Waltz from Florida. Clay Higgins from Louisiana. And Pat Fallon from Texas. On the Democratic side, 6 of them. Jason Crow from Colorado, Lou Correa from California, Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania, Chrissy Houlihan from Pennsylvania, Glenn Ivey from Maryland, and Jared Moskowitz from Florida. So that's all that's happening tomorrow on Capitol Hill, Hal, and it's a lot. And we're getting a better sense, Hal, of the timeline, or at least the date, of when this interview is going to take place between the FBI and between Trump himself. Trump was in an interview tonight with Laura Ingraham on the Fox News channel, and he was indicating that it's going to be taking place, Hal, sometime on Thursday of this week. Hal, are you surprised that that victim interview with Trump and the FBI hasn't happened yet?
Actually, I'm not really surprised. Andrew, I saw former President Trump pushing back on that a lot. I think when Director Wray gave that testimony where he kind of basically questioned whether Trump had been shot in the ear, indicating it could have been something else. Well, I think that put a damper on goodwill for a bit there. And you got to remember, Donald Trump has a long history with the FBI, and I wouldn't call it a cozy history with the FBI, particularly former Director Comey. And so he's probably a little skeptical of whatever interview process is going to happen there. So I'm not surprised it did take quite a bit of time, because he's got to build a certain comfort zone, if you will, that they're going to be very objective in terms of how they do that. Just regardless of whatever the FBI says, he had to be the one that made that decision. And I had a feeling that eventually he would sit down with them and talk about it, but I could tell that he was a little reluctant to do so. And certainly, Director Wray's comments didn't alleviate probably any concerns he had in that regard.
So, Hal, I want to reference this from over the weekend because it was a very brief, terse statement from the FBI, because there was this back and forth on social media over the weekend about, whether or not an actual bullet hit Trump's ear or whether it was glass from the teleprompter or purely just shrapnel. And this is what the FBI said to clear this up. They said, quote, "What struck former President Trump in the ear was a bullet, whether whole or fragmented into smaller pieces, fired from the deceased subject's rifle." So it seems like they wanted to really clear that up as quickly as possible. Also, we're being told in our reporting that this interview, Hal, with the FBI and Trump will be quite standard. They'll ask Trump about his experience and what happened from his perspective here. Is that how these things go? I mean, Trump is a victim, and they're interviewing the victim.
Well, they want to get his, he has a kind of a unique situation. They're interviewing everybody around him, but they want to know, what did he see? And of course, what did he feel? And what did he hear? And they want to kind of build a timeline to get a kind of a breakdown of exactly what happened in what order. They'll probably want to know if he actually did see where the shots are coming from, or maybe even saw the shooter. These are all things that are just going to be filling out that investigative report to get a better picture of what happened. Probably anything he could observe of those around him. They're going to want to know what the Secret Service did. What did they say? When did they move? How fast did it happen? He's probably going to have, he may not realize it, and the FBI are expert interviewers, if you will. I could say interrogators, but they are expert at drawing a lot of information out that at many times the victims themselves don't even realize they know. And so that's the process they're going to work through, and it's going to hopefully fill in some gaps in terms of what happened on that day, and also give a better timeline. I don't know how long they're going to take it, but it may also make a better timeline as to if anything. And there may have been something said. They may find out something that nobody knows about, that there was something said where maybe one of the Secret Service agents did hear something. Yeah. We haven't heard anything about that. I would imagine we would have heard something about it by now. But if there was any warning or anything like that, it's amazing in the process that all sorts of information will surface that previously was unknown. And I think that's what the FBI is going to try and find out. I have a feeling, though, it'll just kind of really just reinforce everything that we've known so far.
Yeah, how there was a call today by senior FBI officials and reporters, Jake Gibson and David Spunt there at the DOJ for Fox. They were on that call. And we got a new FBI timeline. And I'm going to read some of it here. And you can point out what we have gleaned from the FBI on the timeline specifically since you and I last spoke. So they say this: the ammunition was purchased legally that day, 50 rounds from a local gun store. The morning of July 13th at 11 o'clock in the morning, he left his home. He spent an hour near the shooting site. Then he returned home. At 1:30 in the afternoon, he left his house and told his parents he was going to the shooting range. At 3:45, Crooks arrived back on the scene and began flying his drone approximately around 3:50 p.m. Remember, the shooting took place around 6:13 p.m. So there are no photos or video taken from the drone. There was no memory card in the drone, which I find interesting. At approximately 4 p.m., Crooks drove around the area of the shooting. Shortly after 5 p.m., he was identified as a quote-unquote suspicious person. SWAT operators found him using a rangefinder around 5:30 p.m. that day. At 5:56, he was found carrying a backpack near the AGR building, the same building that he climbed the roof of to carry out the shooting. Crooks climbed the building using an HVAC piping to get onto the roof. He jumped on other rooftops to get to the final position to take his shots. We now know as well, confirmed by the FBI, Hal, he fired 8 rounds before being neutralized. The FBI found 8 shell casings at the scene. Any gaps in there that you would like to fill in from more reporting, more answers from the FBI, Hal?
Well, one thing that has come out is that at that 4:30, the word went out. They did text, and there was a timeline of all the texts that took place. And apparently, and I'm still trying to figure out why, the Secret Service and local law enforcement weren't talking to each other. Information just was not getting passed, or it was getting, quote, air gapped, if you will. That information wasn't going directly to the agents as far as what local law enforcement was seeing and how that was being communicated across the board. And that really put some real slowdown, if you will, I would say some kinks in their plan throughout the day. The other part I thought, which was really a big oversight, is that the Secret Service snipers were supposed to meet local law enforcement. They were supposed to meet the local law enforcement snipers and their SWAT team and do all that pre-event coordination to make sure everything. That's where things such as communication, like, hey, do I have your cell phone so I can text you? Here, let's do a test text. This is attention to detail. These are things you do preliminary. If you're doing any sort of operation, you would do this. You make sure everybody's got the same time on their watches, everything across the board. That meeting did not happen. Now, I don't know why. I would guess the Secret Service is going to say we just had too much going on. We didn't get around to it. But you can see it has had catastrophic effects. They had a long time. They had over an hour and a half before the shooting to track this guy down.
Yeah.
And there was just a series of errors in following him and tracking him. And of course, the fact that he actually got up there and took 8 shots, that's the biggest failure of all. But there was a lot going on. And I would like to mention one other thing, too. They have also found that apparently he was acquiring materials and doing other things about a year before this. So he'd been doing research. He'd been looking at acquisition of materials, explosive materials, things like that. That is actually interesting. And on top of that, it does appear he had an escape plan. That thing he had, those explosives with that triggering device, he actually was planning on doing an explosion to basically mask or divert everybody's attention while he tried to make an escape.
Sure.
I find this all fascinating, the information that really has popped up in the last, say, 24 or 48 hours.
Fascinating because he wasn't known to any law enforcement. Is that why you find it fascinating? With the level of methodology and planning and preparation that we now know?
I find it interesting from the very beginning, where it looked like it was almost not a spur of the moment, but it was something he hadn't really planned well in advance.
Yeah, right.
And now you look at starting to realize, hey, he was thinking about doing something like this for at least a year, and he was researching various things. And you and I had talked on the air when the Slovakian prime minister, the attempted assassination there, and it appears that he was doing the research, the kind of research you would expect a wannabe assassin to do. That's what a lot of these shooters do, not necessarily assassins, but active shooters. They will research other shootings. They will research other things to pick up whatever they can from those events. And that's exactly what he was doing. And he was doing a long time advance. I am a little surprised that he didn't appear on the radar of law enforcement, but he didn't have a record. And I think the thing that would have really triggered it is if they picked up on the drone, the pre-event surveillance they picked up on the drone, and that's one I can't quite figure out, which is why the site wasn't secured, why they weren't doing counter reconnaissance on the site several hours beforehand. Why wasn't that picked up?
So just some more notes from this call today from FBI Special Agent in Charge in Pittsburgh, Kevin Rojek. He was the individual we heard from the very night of the shooting at that press conference. He said this: there's still no motive, that the gun was legally transferred from Crooks's father to him last year. I think we knew that. That the weapon had a collapsible stock, but the FBI still wants to know how he concealed the rifle until the moments before the shooting. I mean, that is the big question, right? I mean, how did he carry this in? This is a large weapon without being noticed.
It's a large weapon, and there's a couple of theories. One is he broke the weapon down. Collapsible stock kind of opened up some new options when that actually came out. They said, well, that'd make it easier to collapse it down. But the problem you have with that is even if you were to break down the weapon so you could put it in a backpack and then you got up there, when you put it together, and of course, if you're putting it together, there's all sorts of things that can happen. Something could fall and drop in the grass or whatever. And the next thing you know, he's got a mess. So the thought really is that he may have hid that weapon in and around the air conditioning unit, somewhere in that area where it was easy access. It was already put together. You know, he didn't have all that Murphy's Law stuff that could happen where something could go wrong. He had a weapon he'd fired before. He was sure that it was going to work, and he probably hit it there. That's the most likely scenario, but that's what the FBI is trying to figure out. When did he do that? How did he do that? And how did they not detect that? How does it, when they, you know, certainly there was some walk around the building. How did that not get seen? Although I will tell you that those walk-arounds and those buildings and stuff, if you know how to hide something, you know, you could probably hide a weapon like that and it would not be easily observed and they could miss it.
I see. There was also a back and forth last week about how he got onto the roof, whether he used a ladder. We know now from the FBI that essentially he climbed the building using an HVAC and piping to get on the roof. On the ladder question, they say the ladder he purchased around the time of the shooting was left near his home 50 miles from the site of the shooting in Butler, PA, his home in Bethel Park. It was not used at all on the day of the shooting there. So I thought that was interesting. To the point of the IEDs, we learned from this call that 2 explosive devices were recovered near the rally site and 1 explosive device in his bedroom, ammunition boxes with explosive material and wires as well from the rally site. Both IEDs from the subject's vehicle did not explode because the receivers were in the off position. They say the IED from Crooks's house missed components and was not functional there. So more details about kind of the explosive aspect to this whole ordeal here. We also are learning more details about just his social life, kind of his personal psychology, that they say his social circle was limited to immediate family. They said he didn't have many friends in his life. He was somewhat of a loner there, and that tracks with what we have reported as well. Also, though, last spring, they say he made 25 gun purchases using online aliases. So to your point, Hal, he was thinking about this well in advance, more than a year.
He was thinking about it. He was also using standard criminal tradecraft, you know, using an alias, an AKA, if you will, to make purchases online tied to weapons. What's interesting is with the IEDs, you may remember the San Bernardino Inland Regional Center shooting in December of 2015. We remember it as a shooting because the explosions, the explosives that they put in there, the IEDs that they put in there, didn't work. At that point, it wasn't because they switched something off. It was because basically the walls were absorbing the RF signal, and thank goodness they couldn't detonate remotely. And it's believed that after the shooting, they drove by to try and do it, to try and set them off, and they couldn't do it. So that's not unusual. We've seen that with other incidents. If you want to go back to Columbine, same thing. They had explosives. They didn't go off. So in many cases, there will be explosives with these, I don't know, amateurs, if you will, that try to set this up. But it takes a little bit of knowledge on how to do that. And they may have an intent to use it, but they may not have the skills and knowledge to really understand some of the intricacies of actually using an explosive device in a remote detonator. And frankly, thank goodness they don't. Sure. That actually works out. But in this case, I'm not surprised. You know, when they found explosives, I kind of had a feeling there was probably something in terms of remotely that didn't work. Yeah.
Okay. Hal, also 2 questions that come to mind after each kind of tragic event, maybe a mass shooting or what have you, is, you know, did they have an extensive documented history of mental health issues, and or did any family members or friends know about some of these plans? Those questions were asked about on the call today, and they answered as best as they could. They said there was no mental health visits from Crooks in the past or any indication of medication that he was taking. So I thought that was interesting. Also, a question was posed, did people in the house know about pre-planning? The FBI said his parents have been incredibly cooperative since day one. The parents have said they had no advanced knowledge of any of this, and the FBI finds this to be credible at this point in the investigation. Hal, we got to go. Before we go, though, obviously we'll be preparing this hearing in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee tomorrow. Are you expecting more answers?
I'm expecting to hear quite a few things, and I think we're going to hear a lot more from the Secret Service. I do not expect to hear a repeat or see a repeat of what we had before with Director Cheadle. I think there'll be much more forthcoming. I wouldn't be surprised if the FBI and Secret Service are kind of comparing notes right now to make sure that they fill in all the blanks and they answer all the questions as best they can. There are some things they're going to have to hold back. There's obviously some things with the investigation they don't want to reveal them too soon because some of it may be somewhat speculative. They may not have the answer, so they don't want to say anything. They may be working a theory, a hypothesis, a lead or something, following that down, but they don't want to say anything. But I think what you're going to see is probably a much more expansive, much more fulfilling, if you will, hearing than you saw before. That one with Director Cheadle, that was about the worst I have ever seen. Of course, it also resulted in her being she having to resign the very next day.
That's right.
Yeah.
All right, Hal. Can't thank you enough. As always, we'll talk soon.